What's up, guitar sexies? Welcome back. Death to the Fingers. Going to be looking at this really awesome sort of arpeggio exercise that couples up using the cycle of fourths and the circle of fifths, and it's really weird. I was working on this exercise myself last week, and of course, my new guitar BFF, Rick Graham, he released a 2.5-hour video yesterday, a compilation of a whole bunch of lessons. There's some really good ones in there. Go check them out. The one specifically on like the diminishing arpeggio sequence with the major 7 moving to the dominant 7, moving to the minor 7, moving to the minor 7 flat 5, moving to the fully diminished on the A string. That's an incredibly useful exercise. The one where he talks about the 1-4-5 chord progression using dominant 7 chords and then using the Mixolydian mode to fill it in. Very useful. The essentially the classical method using intervals. So seconds, thirds, fourths, fifths, sixths, and sevenths. Also, all of these things can be factored into your guitar playing regime right now. And honestly, these things will pay massive dividends in the long run. And of course, this exercise here, essentially using music principles, in this case, the cycle of fourths, to get a much better sort of comprehension on voice leading and the movement of chords. But instead of just basically doing a one-for-one lesson with respect to what he did, because he already did the lesson. Think of this one as like an intermediary lesson, the thing you need to do before you can actually get to that lesson and play it. So you need to be able to do this one first before you're ever going to get there and do the one that he did. And of course, there's always this sort of like thinking step in between that I like to add so that you have to essentially adapt over this exercise so you can then make it work in the context that he's explaining. This gives you the maximum sort of learning potential with respect to doing this stuff. What is the point of learning some pointless lick or riff or whatever it is that you can't really use when you can develop your mind and basically learn how to use music concepts like this to absolutely ridiculous effect where people are just like, damn, and he proves it. When you see him do it, you're like, see how he does it? Not only do you have the inversions to contend with, not only do you have moving the roots around, which we're all going to look at this stuff, but also then add another layer of complexity by playing in thirds. So get your booties on. Yikes. All right, that's the end of the intro. We're going to go through this step by step, starting with the cycle of force and musical gravity. All right, I do not want to get into some long-winded explanation with respect to the circle of fifths and the cycle of fourths, or the circle of fourths, or whatever you want to call it. I don't care. Basically moving in one direction in fifths and moving in the opposite direction fourths. And that's the first thing you need to understand is when you put those two intervals together, so to speak, basically what happens is you get the inverse. Okay, so if I go from one note C up to F, that's a fourth. But if I go from the high C down to F, that's a fifth. So there's a bit of musical symmetry going on there. And you're like, okay, what is the point of that? It actually comes in handy to know that later on and understanding how that works with other intervals too, because then you can see two basically enharmonic intervals. Yeah, I just did. So the thing with the cycle of forces is it's a visual representation of musical gravity. If I start off here like we are going to in essentially E major, like Rick does, then that position there, when I create the first chord, the E major chord, if I add the 7th degree and flatten it, okay, I corrupt that major chord, creating musical gravity that's going to make it pull towards another chord. And of course, yes, you guessed it, it's going to go to the A. And if I play A7, it will pull towards D. And then when I corrupt the D chord to D7, it's going to pull towards G, and so on and so forth. And I think you're seeing a method behind the madness here. Essentially, not only does this music concept allow you to modulate to other keys, if you're writing a song or you want to do a lift or something like that, this is a great way of doing it. It also sort of explains the 5-1 cadence or the resolution, if you will, with respect to chords. So there's a lot of information going on here, but that's the long and short of it. I have this one position. If I were to play this chord now as a dominant 7 chord, it creates this effect where it wants to move to the one preceding. And you can keep doing that until you get through all 12 keys. And there's lots and lots and lots of music that uses this methodology, either in a couple steps or in 3 and 4. Normally you wouldn't go past like 2 or 3, but whatever, sky's the limit, knock yourself out. And there it is. And so this little tool here, if you will, is great to have around if you want to sort of use that. But realistically speaking, you should just use this as an exercise where you can just move around the fretboard playing these arpeggios again and again and again. And we do dominant 7 in this case, but you could do them with majors. You could do a combination where you do a major, then play a dominant 7 version of it, and then move to the next one that's closest to it in the next inversion. So there's a whole bunch of ways of actually applying these exercises once you really sit down and start thinking about it. There's this one, there's the one that Rick shows, there's the one I just explained there. They're all slightly different and they're all highly usable because essentially it's just another way of visualizing the fretboard, which makes you that much better of a player. So now that we've basically explained that part, the musical gravity and the function of these dominant 7 chords, let's look at essentially the key we're going to be playing in, and then building the dominant 7 arpeggios, and then stringing those together using the cycle of force. All right, step 1 here is basically what I call setting the table. It's laying out the parameters, and since we're going to basically emulate to a certain degree, or at least make possible to follow the same more advanced lesson, we're going to start in the key of E2 with respect to the cycle of force. And that way these two things can marry up. So you can start off with this more intermediate level lesson, and then you can move to the more advanced one later on when you get good at this one and can essentially accomplish these tasks. So setting the table means I have to basically lay out the sonic range of the E major scale. Right, so in this first example, you hear me play essentially the E major in the open position, but of course I could have played an E-type chord barred at the 12th fret. And you hear me play the E major triad arpeggio. That's a big one, obviously. Then you have the E major scale, the Ionian mode. That's another big one. And of course, the pentatonic scale, in this case, the major pentatonic, another big one. If there is no pentatonic, no big deal. Right, but if there is, that should be included in the information. This essentially lays out the entire foundation from which I'm going to work with. It lays out all 7 notes of the diatonic scale. It gives me all the positions for major and minor and diminished chords, and effectively maps out the fretboard related to E major, which is then going to be used to then map out these dominant 7 chords. Right, so let's look at the example. All right, in the Rick Graham example, he does basically all dominant 7 chords. So now what we're going to do is basically assume that this 12th fret is now essentially the 5th degree of a major scale. Okay, E is now the 5th degree of what major scale? I'll let you guys answer that one in the comments below. But so I'm now got E mixolydian in the root. And so that's going to allow me to now map out all of these dominant 7 arpeggio inversions, which is the next step. After I lay out the basic stuff, where am I in the key of E major, the key of A major, the key of F sharp major? Once I've established that, then I can move to the 5th degree of that scale system and effectively now map out all these dominant 7 arpeggios, which is going to be essential for the next step. And as you can see, I end up way down here, essentially at the 4th fret, right, of the low E string. And so that will become the starting position because I can play a lot of arpeggios in and around that area, and it gives me enough room to essentially move around the fretboard so I can do as many sequences as I want. So I can keep climbing up, essentially, so I can keep this exercise going forever. I only do like whatever, 4 or 5 iterations. You can keep going by doing all 12, and you probably should. And then you can just make them longer or switch up the pairs, whatever you want to do. Right, so let's map out these dominant 7 arpeggios. All right, here we are at the end. Essentially now what we want to do is pair up a couple of these sequences together and then just basically use the circle of force to move to the next one, right? So of course I'm going to start off with E7 here and try to see these as the inversions that they are. In this case, it's a first inversion and a second inversion of the E7 sort of dominant 7 chord, right? Played as an arpeggio. That came out a little weird, whatever. Right? And then from there, I want to jump back down, okay? And I'm going to do the A7. And I'm going to do 2 iterations. Now, listen, it doesn't matter if you do it exactly the way I do it, where I did it more sort of in a linear fashion, so it didn't get too complicated, but you could go up, down. You can just move to whichever one you want. You can start looking at them where the roots are on different strings and stuff like that, and you probably should. But my point being here is I'm just showing you like a simple version of what we're doing by just using the obvious stuff, but this isn't the only version. You can go forwards and backwards, and you can really start to mess around with it in ways that you probably didn't realize. So don't assume it's as simplistic as it seems, even though this is a challenging exercise. There's no doubt about it, right? So you're going to see me basically go through the entire sequence and stuff like that. And in your own mind, you should be seeing that it's essentially me playing the same arpeggio in just 2 inversions that are next to each other. And then after I'm done this little set, I basically move to the next one that's in the cycle. Right? So I go from the E to the A, and then I go from A to D, and then D to G, of course, and then G to C, before I end with a bunch of triads and a major 7 in F major, right? And I could have kept going, jumped down to B flat, and then E flat, and all the rest of that stuff. But the idea here is just get good with some of the simple ones, and there's some extra stuff in there to really break down, again, the inversions and the interval structure that you're working with. Which one is the root, which one is the third, which one is the 5th, and which one is the flat and 7th. Understand that when you build these things, you're kind of taking a major scale and you're lowering the 7th to get the Mixolydian mode, which then if you choose every other note in that mode, you're going to get the dominant 7 chord created, because that's what happens at the 5th degree of a major scale. When you put 4 of these things in a group, you get a major chord if it's just 3 notes grouped together as a chord, and it's a dominant 7 chord. And then you have a whole variety of dominant 7ths. You have altered dominants, and you have dominant 9s and dominant 13s. So there's a whole bunch of extra flavors in there that you can start expanding on after the fact. But of course, step number 1 is just get this done. And of course, once you get this done, you can start to reduce the spread by playing them all in the same place like Rick does. And then of course, take it to the ultimate level by adding another more complex technique in there, like playing them in thirds or possibly sixths, another savage exercise. So I hope this helps, of course. And, you know, again, exercise your theory so that when you go watch a video like his, you can basically be like, I already know this one, and now I can quickly adapt it over to play this other one, and I've just doubled my mileage, and both are absolutely killer. So, enjoy the ride, and of course, we'll see you in the next one.